Good morning. Welcome back. They heard the howl, the beastly howl, and Halt said that it's a Kalkar and they have a new target and they're hunting. The three companions spent a sleepless night as the hunting cries of the Kalkara dwindled to the north. When they first heard the sounds, Galan had moved to saddle Blaze, the bay horse snorting nervously at the fearsome howling of the two beasts. Halt, however, gestured for him to stop. "I'm not going after those things in the dark," he said briefly. "We'll wait till first light, then look for their tracks." The tracks were easy enough to find, as the Kalkara obviously made no attempt to conceal their passing. The long grass had been crushed by the two heavy bodies, leaving a clear trail pointing east-northeast. Halt found the trail left by the first of the two monsters, and then a few minutes later, Galan found the second, about a quarter-kilometer to the left, and traveling parallel, close enough to provide support in case of an attack, but distant enough to avoid any traps set for its brother. Halt considered the situation for a few moments, then came to a decision. "You stay with the second one," he told Galan. "Will and I will follow this one. I want to make sure they both keep heading in the same direction. I don't want one of them doubling back to come behind us." "You think they know we're here?" Will asked, working hard to keep his voice sounding steady and disinterested. "They could. There's been time for that plainsman we saw to have warned them. Or maybe it's just coincidence that they're heading out on their next mission." He glanced at the trail of crushed grass, moving irrevocably in one constant direction. "They certainly seem to have a purpose." He turned to Galan again. In any event, keep your eyes peeled and pay close attention to Blaze. The horse will sense these beasts before we will. We don't want to run into an ambush." Galan nodded and swung Blaze away to return to the second trail. At a hand signal from Halt, the three rangers began riding forward, following the direction the Kalkara had taken. "I'll watch the trail," Halt told Will. "You keep an eye on Galan, just in case." Will turned his attention to the tall rangers some 200 meters away, and keeping pace with them. Blaze was only visible from the shoulders up, his lower half masked by the long grass. From time to time, undulations in the intervening ground took both rider and horse out of sight. The first time this happened, Will reacted with a cry of alarm as Galan simply disappeared into the ground. Halt turned quickly, an arrow ready at half-draw, but at that moment Galan and Blaze reappeared, seemingly unconscious of the moment of panic they had caused. "Sorry," Will muttered, annoyed that he had allowed his nerves to get the better of him. Halt regarded him shrewdly. "That's all right," he said, steadily. "I'd rather you let me know anytime you think there's a problem." Halt knew only too well that, having called a false alarm once, Will might be reluctant to react next time, and that could be fatal for both of them. "Tell me every time you lose sight of Galan, and tell me again when he reappears," he said. Will nodded, understanding his teacher's reasoning. And so they rode on, the keening cry of the flutes swelling in their ears again as they approached the stone circle. This time they would pass much closer, Will realized, as the Kalkara seemed to be headed straight for the site. As they rode, their passage was marked by intermittent reports from Will. "He's gone. Still gone. All right, I see him again." The dips and rises in the ground were virtually invisible under the waving cover of tall grass. In fact, Will was never sure whether it was Galan passing through a depression or he and Halt. Often it was a combination of both. There was one bad time Galan and Blaze sank from sight and didn't reappear within the customary few seconds. "I can't see him," Will reported. Then, still gone, no sign of him." His voice began to rise in pitch as the tension grew within him. "No sign of them. Still no sign." Halt brought Abelard to a stop, his bow ready once again, his eyes searching the ground to their far left as they waited for Galan to reappear. He let go a piercing whistle, 3 ascending notes. There was a pause, then an answering whistle. This time, the same 3 notes in descending order came clearly to them. Will heaved a sigh of relief, and just at that moment, Galan reappeared, large as life. He faced them and made a large gesture with both arms raised in an obvious question, "What's the problem?" Halt made a negative gesture, and they moved on. As they approached the stone flutes, Halt became more and more watchful. The Kalkara that he and Will were trailing were heading straight toward their circle. He reined in Abelard and shaded his eyes, studying the dismal gray rocks intently, looking for movement or any sign that the Kalkara might be lying in wait to ambush them. It's the only decent cover for miles around, he said. Let's not take the chance that the thing could be lurking in there waiting for us. We'll go a little carefully, I think. He signaled for Galan to join them and explain the situation. Then they split up to form a wide perimeter around the stones, riding in slowly from three different directions, checking their horses for any possible reaction as they came closer. But the sight was empty, although close up, the jangling moan of the wind through the flute holes was close to unbearable. Halt chewed his lip reflectively, staring out across the sea of grass as the two undeviating trails left by the Kalkara. This is taking us too long, he said finally. As long as we can see their trails for a couple of 100 meters ahead, we'll move faster. Slow down when you come to a rise or any time when the trail isn't visible for more than 50 meters. Galan nodded his understanding and resumed his wide position. They urged their horses on now in a canter, and the easy lope of the ranger horse that would eat the kilometers ahead of them. Will maintained his watch on Galan, and whenever the visible trail diminished, either Halt or Galan would whistle, and they would slow to a walk until the ground opened up again before them. As night fell, they camped once again. Halt still refused to follow the two killers in the dark, even though the moon meant their trail was easily visible. Too easy for them to double back in the dark, he said. I want plenty of warning when they finally come at us. You think they will? Asked Will, noticing that Halt had said when, not if. The ranger smiled reassuringly at his young pupil. Always assume an enemy knows you're there and that he will attack you, he said. That way, you tend to avoid unpleasant surprises. He smiled grimly to reassure the boy. It can still be unpleasant, but at least it's not a surprise. In the morning, they resumed the trail once more, moving at the same brisk pace, slowing only when they had no clear sight of the lie of the land ahead of them. By early afternoon, they had reached the edge of the plain and rode once again into the wooded country to the north of the mountain of rain and night. Here, they found the two Kalkara had joined company, no longer keeping the wide separation they had maintained on the open ground of the plain. But their chosen path remained the same, east of northeast. The three rangers followed this course for another hour before Halt reined in Abelard and signaled the others to dismount for a conference. They grouped around a map of the kingdom that he had unrolled out on the grass, using arrows as weights to stop the edges from re-rolling. Judging from their tracks, we've made up some time on them, he said. But there's still a good half day ahead of us. Now, this is the direction they're following. He took another arrow and laid it on the map, orienting it so that it pointed to the direction the Kalkara had been following for the past 2 days and nights. As you can see, if they keep going in this direction, there are only 2 places of any significance that they could be heading for. He pointed to a place on the map. Here, the Gorlan ruins, or farther north, Castle Arielon itself. Galan drew in a breath sharply. Castle Arielon? He said. You don't think they dare try for King Duncan? Halt looked at him and shook his head. I simply don't know, he replied. We don't know nearly enough about these beasts, and half of what we think we know is probably myth and legend. But you've got to admit, it would be a bold stroke, a master stroke, and Morgorath has never been averse to this sort of thing. He let the others digest that thought for a few moments, and then traced a line from their current position to the northwest. Now, I've been thinking. Look, here's Castle Redmont, perhaps a day's ride away, and then another day to here. From Redmont, he traced a line northeast to the Gorlan ruins, marked on the map. One person riding hard and using 2 horses could make it in less than a day to Redmont, and then lead the Baron and Sir Rodney here to the ruins. If the Kalkara keep moving at the pace they are, we might just be able to intercept them there. It'll be close, but it's possible. And with 2 warriors like Erold and Rodney on hand, we'll stand a far better chance of stopping the things once and for all. Well, one moment, Halt, Galan interrupted. You said 1 person riding 2 horses? Halt met Galan's gaze with his own. He could see that the young ranger had already divined what he had in mind. That's right, Galan, he said, and the lightest one among us will travel faster. I want you to turn Blaze over to Will. If he alternates between Tug and your horse, he can do it in the time. He saw the reluctance on Galan's face and understood it perfectly. No ranger would like the idea of handing his horse over to someone else, even another ranger. But at the same time, Galan understood the logic behind the suggestion. Halt waited for the younger man to break the silence, while Will watched the two of them, eyes wide with alarm at the thought of the responsibility that was about to be loaded onto him. Finally, reluctantly, Galan broke the silence. "I suppose it makes sense," he said. "So, what do you want me to do?" "Follow behind me on foot," Holt said briskly, rolling the chart up and replacing it in the saddle. "If you can get hold of a horse anywhere, do so and catch up with me. Otherwise, we'll rendezvous at Gorlan. If we miss the Kalkara there, Will can wait for you, with Blaze. I'll keep following the Kalkara until you all catch up with me." Galan nodded his acquiescence, and Holt felt a surge of fondness for him as he did. Once Galan saw the sense of his proposal, he wasn't the kind to raise arguments or objections. He did say rather ruefully, "I thought you said my sword might come in handy." "I did," replied Holt, "but this gives me a chance to bring in 2 fully armed knights with axes and lances, and you know that's the best way to fight the Kalkara." "True," said Galan, and then taking Blaze's bridle, he knotted the reins together and threw them over the bay's neck. "You may as well start out on Tug," he said to Will. "That'll give Blaze a chance to rest. He'll follow behind you without a lead rein, and so will Tug when you're riding Blaze. Tie the reins up like this on Tug's neck so they don't dangle down and snag anything." He began to turn back to Holt, then remembered something. "Oh, yes, before you mount him for the first time, remember to say Brown Eyes." "Brown Eyes," Will repeated, and Galan couldn't help grinning. "Not to me, to the horse." It was an old ranger joke, and they all smiled, and then Holt brought him back to the business at hand. "Will, you're confident you can find your way to Redmont?" Will nodded. He touched the pocket where he kept his own copy of the chart and glanced at the sun for direction. "Northwest," he said rightly, indicating the direction he had chosen. Holt nodded and satisfied. "You'll strike the Salmon River before dusk. That will give you a good reference point. And the main highway is just a little way west of the river. Keep to a steady canter all the way. Don't try to race the horses. You'll just tire them out that way, and you'll be slower in the long run. Travel safely now." Holt swung up onto Abelard's saddle, and Will mounted Tug. Galan pointed to Will and spoke to Blaze's ear. Follow Blaze. Follow, Blaze. Follow." The bay horse, intelligent as all ranger horses were, tossed his head as if in acknowledgement of the order. Before they parted, Will had one more question that had been bothering him. "Holt," he said, "the Gorlan runes, what exactly are they?" "It's ironic, isn't it?" Holt replied. "They're the runes of Castle Gorlan, Morgorath's former fiefdom." Where am I going to? Chapter 28. The ride to Castle Redmont soon settled into a blur of weariness. The 2 horses maintained the steady lope for which they had been bred. The temptation, of course, was to urge Tug into a wild gallop with Blaze following behind, but Will knew that such a course would be self-defeating. He was moving at the horse's best speed. As old Bob, the horse trainer, had told him, ranger horses could maintain a canter all day without tiring. It was a different matter for the rider. Added to the physical effort of moving constantly to the rhythm of whichever horse he was riding, and the 2 had distinctly different gaits, due to their differences in size, was the equally debilitating mental strain. What if Holt were wrong? What if the Kalkara had suddenly veered to the west and were heading now on a course that would intercept his? What if he made some terrible mistake and failed to reach Redmont in time? That last fear, the fear of self-doubt, was the hardest one of all to deal with. In spite of the hard training he had been undergoing over the past few months, he was still a little more than a boy. What was more, he had always had Holt's judgment and experience to rely on in this past. Now, he was alone, and he knew how much depended on his ability to carry out the task he had been set. The thoughts, the doubts, the fears crowded his mind, numbing over each other, jostling for position. The Salmon River came and went beneath the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. He paused to water the horses briefly at the bridge, and then, once on the King's Highway, he made excellent time, with only short halts at regular intervals to change his mount. The day's shadows lengthened, and the trees overhanging the road grew dark and menacing. Each noise from the darkening trees, each vaguely seen different in the shadows, brought his heart to his mouth with a lurch. Here, an owl hooted and stooped to fasten his claws around an unwary mouse. There, a badger prowled, hunting its prey like a gray shadow in the underneath of the forest. With each movement and noise, Will's imagination worked overtime. He began to see great black figures, much as he had imagined a Kalkara would look like, in every path of shadow, in every dark clump of bushes that stirred with the light breeze. Reason told him that there was almost no chance that the Kalkara would be seeking him out. Imagination and fear replied that they were abroad somewhere, and who was to say they weren't close by? Imagination and fear won. And so the long, fear-filled night passed until the low light of dawn found a weary figure hunched in the saddle of a sturdy, barrel-chested horse that drove steadily onwards to the northwest. Dozing in the saddle, Will snapped awake with a start, feeling the first warmth of the sun's rays upon him. Gently, he rein tugged in, and the little horse stood, head down, sides heaving. Will realized he had been riding far longer than he should have been, his fear having driven him to keep Tug running through the darkness long after he should have rested him. He dismounted stiffly, aching in every joint, and paused to rub the horse's soft nose affectionately. "Sorry, boy," he said. Tug, reacting to the touch and the voice that he now knew so well, tossed his head and shook his shaggy mane. If Will had asked it, he would have continued uncomplaining until he dropped. Will looked around. The cheerful light of early morning had dispelled all the dark fears of the night before. Now he had felt slightly foolish as he remembered those moments of choking panic. He gave his horse 10 minutes respite until Tug's breathing seemed to settle and his sides ceased heaving. Then, marveling at the recuperative powers and endurance of the Ranger horse breed, he tightened the girths on Blaze's saddle and swung astride the bay, groaning softly as he did so. Ranger horses might recover quickly. Ranger apprentices took a little longer. It was late morning when Castle Redmont finally came into sight. Will was riding Tug again, and the small horse, seemingly none the worse for the hard night, had put in, as they crested the last row of hills in the green valley of Erold's barony stretched out before them. Exhausted, Will stopped for a few seconds, leaning tiredly on the pommel. They had come so far, so quickly. He looked with relief on the familiar sight of the castle, and the tiny little village that nestled contentedly in its shadow. Smoke was rising from chimneys. Farmers were walking slowly home from their fields for their midday meal. The castle itself stood solid and reassuring in its bulk at the crest of the hill. "It looks so normal," Will said to his horse. Somehow he realized he had been expecting to find things changed. The kingdom was about to go to war again for the first time in 15 years, but here life went on as normal. Then, realizing he was wasting time, he urged Tug forward until he was stretched out in a gallop, both boy and horse eager to finish this final leg of the journey. People looked up in surprise at the rapid passing of the small green and gray-clad figure, hunched low over the neck of his dusty horse, with a larger bay horse following behind. One or two of the villagers recognized Will and called a greeting, but their words were lost in the rattle of the hooves. The rattle turned to an echoing drumming as they swept across the lower drawbridge into the foreyard of the castle itself. Then the drumming became an urgent clattering on the cobblestones of the yard. Will drew back lightly on the reins, and Tug slid to a halt by the entrance to Baron Erold's tower. The two men-at-arms on duty there, surprised by his sudden appearance and breakneck pace, stepped forward and barred his path with their crossed spikes. "Just a moment, you," said one of them, a corporal. "Where do you think you're off to in such a clatter and a rush?" Will opened his mouth to reply, but before words could form, an angry voice boomed from behind him. "What do you think you're doing, you idiot? Don't you recognize a king's ranger when you see one?" It was Sir Rodney, striding across the courtyard on his way to see the Baron. The two sentries stiffened to attention as Will turned gratefully to the battle master. "Sir Rodney," he said. Oh, sorry, camera fell. "Sir Rodney," he said, "I have an urgent message from Holt for Lord Erold and yourself." As Holt had observed to Will after the boar hunt, the battle master was a shrewd man. He took in Will's disheveled clothing, the two dusty horses standing. Oh, I am so sorry. I am having trouble keeping the camera propped up. I have pillows that I'm using. So, whoops. Okay, so now, all right, we'll see how long this lasts before it tips over again. He took in Will's disheveled clothing, the two dusty horses standing, heads drooping tiredly, and realized that this was no time for a lot of foolish questions. He jerked a thumb at the doorway. Best come in and tell us then. He then turned to the sentries. Have these horses looked after. Feed and water them. Not too much of either, please, Sir Rodney, Will said quickly. Just a small amount of grain and water, and maybe you could have them rubbed down. I'll be needing them again soon. Rodney's eyebrows rose at that. Will and the horses looked as if they could use a long rest. Something must be urgent, he said, adding to the corporal. See to the horses, then, and have food brought to Baron Harold's study, and a jug of cold milk. The two knights whistled in astonishment as Will told them the news. Word had already come that Morgorath was mustering his army, and the Baron had sent out messengers to assemble his own troops, both knights and men-at-arms. But the news of the Calcara was something else entirely. No hint of that had reached Castle Redmond. You say Halt thinks that they may be going after the king? Baron Harold said as Will finished speaking. Will nodded and then hesitated before he added, Yes, my lord, but I think there's another possibility. He was loath to go further, but the Baron gestured for him to continue, and he finally gave voice to the suspicion that had been building inside of him through the long night and day. Sir, I think maybe there's a chance that they're after Halt himself. Once the suspicion was voiced and the fear was out in the open to be examined and evaluated, he felt the better of it. Somewhat to his surprise, Baron Harold didn't dismiss the idea. He stroked his beard thoughtfully as he digested the words. Go on, he said, wanting to hear Will's reasoning. It's just that Halt felt Morgorath might be looking for revenge, looking to punish those who fought him last time. And I thought probably Halt did the most harm of all, didn't he? That's true enough, said Rodney. And I thought maybe the Calcara knew we were following them. The plainsmen had plenty of time to find them and tell them. And maybe they were leading Halt on until they found a place for an ambush. So while he thinks he's hunting them, he's actually the one being hunted. And the Gorlon ruins would be an ideal place for it, Harold agreed. In that tumble of rocks, they could be on him before he had a chance to use that longbow of his. Well, Rodney, there's no time to waste. You and I will go. Half armor, I think. We'll move faster that way. Lances, axes, and broadswords. And we'll take 2 horses each. We'll follow Will's example there. We'll leave in an hour. Have Carol gather another 10 knights and follow us as soon as he can. Yes, my lord, the battlemaster replied. Baron Harold turned back to Will. You've done a good job, Will. We'll take care of this now. As for you, you look as if you could use 8 hours solid sleep. Wearily, aching in every muscle and joint, Will drew himself erect. I'd like to come with you, my lord, he said. He sensed that the Baron was about to disagree and added hurriedly, Sir, none of us knows what is going to happen, and Galan is out there somewhere on foot. Besides, he hesitated. Go on, Will, the Baron said quietly, and when the boy looked up, Harold saw the steel in his eyes. Halt is my master, sir, and he's in danger. My place is with him, Will said. The Baron assessed him shrewdly, then came to a decision. Very well, but at least you can get an hour's rest. There's a cot in that annex over there. He indicated a curtained-off section at their study. Why don't you use it? Yes, sir, said Will gratefully. His eyes felt as if he had handfuls of sand rubbed into them. He had never been happier to obey an order in his life. Whew, that's a good place to stop. All right, see you later.